So today we're starting the third portion of Parshat Mikeitz, which is in Genesis chapter 41, verse 39 through 41:52. So before we start reading, we begin with the traditional blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us in his commandments and commanded us to engage in the study of the words of Torah. Our passage begins with the words, Vayomer Paro el Yosef, Acharei hodia, Elohim otecha et kol zot in navon vechacham kamocha. Now, Paro said to Yosef, since God has let you know all of this, there is no one as understanding and wise as you. So we can get context. Yesterday's reading talked about how Yosef was rushed from the pit, the dungeon in which he had been imprisoned for 2 years for fleeing from Potiphar's wife, who falsely accused him of trying to seduce her. And so he finds himself in his prison. God has organized that these two men in the prison with him would be there, that they would have dreams that by the wisdom of God he would be able to interpret. And of course, because he was relying on human means as opposed to godly provision and providence, befitting his level of righteousness, God allowed him to remain in prison for 2 full years until the time would come to pass. And when the time came and the redemption was ready, he whisked him up from the pit at the remembrance of the chief cup bearer, that he said, Paro is having a hard time interpreting his dreams, and therefore I know a guy that could come and help out with this. And so Paro has these 2 dreams, both of which have the same meaning, which is that there's to be 7 years of plenty that will be followed by 7 years of famine that will come and swallow up the entirety of those years. And so at this point, Yosef gives instruction to Paro, and he says, hey, look, you need to delegate responsibility to people who are going to be able to prepare the most efficiently. You're going to need someone who is filled with navon, with binah, with understanding, and with kochma, with wisdom. That's a kacham, it's a sage. And so at this point, Paro, of course, looks at Yosef. He's looked at his interpretation. He sees the fruitfulness to it. And he says, you know what? You're the guy. He says, ultimately, since God, since God has let you know, after all this, there's no one that has the same amount of binah and chacham as you. If anybody can find anybody like this person who's capable of not only hearing the dream, or at least being able to come up with a portion of the dream, or whatever way we try to slice the pie there, he was able to interpret the dream accurately and give him something that was pleasing to him and to his servants. And ultimately, the instructions he gave to Paro were pleasing. And so he is desiring now to appoint him. As we see in verse 40, yishach kol ami rech hakiseh egdal mimecha, that you shall be appointed over my household, and through your command all my people shall be nourished. Only with regards to the kiseh, the throne, that is, of course, the position of kingship, will I be greater than you. So Yosef is given a high level of authority, going from prison now to second in command to Paro and judging the affairs of the entire nation of Egypt, and ultimately the then known world, when all of the nations flow up to Egypt to receive grain, which, as we talked about, is a symbolic way of understanding how the Messiah, son of Joseph, though he is falsely accused of course being not the Messiah of Israel. He's someone who seduced people into idolatry, is some of the things that come out of Jewish belief because of Christian missionary efforts, that Yeshua has this bad rep. He has this bad name, these false accusations given against him. But just as Yosef was swifted up and to become second in command to Pharaoh in a moment, so Messiah will appear in his temple at that time. Yeshua will be restored to his fullest identity. And he will be seen to be truly someone who is understanding and wise, as someone who is befitting to rule not only the nation of Israel, but ultimately the entire world. And all of the nations flowing up to Egypt is symbolic of that day when all the nations will flow up to Jerusalem and pay tribute. As the word Shiloh, as we'll see at the end of Genesis, when it says to the blessing that Jacob gives to his son Judah, he says, you will hold the rain until Shiloh comes. Well, Shiloh, combination of the word, actually means to bring tribute, referring to King Messiah. That is, when King Messiah comes, ultimately the reign of Yehudah will be at its peak, referring to that'll be the time when we will enter into the Messianic era. And so in verse 41, he says, "Vayomer Pahoro," the Pharaoh said to Yosef, "Re'eh natati otecha al kol eretz Mitzrayim. Look, I've appointed you over the entire land of Egypt. Vayesar Paro et tabatzo me'al yado, vayiten ota al yad Yosef, vayalabesh oto bigdei shesh, vayisem rivid hatzahav al Savoro, that Paro removed his ring from his hand, which Rashi mentions here is an expression of the giving of the king's ring as a sign to the one to whom it is given that he is to be second to him in greatness. Okay, so the passing of this ring is something that allows him to exhibit this authority. And it says the raiment of fine linen that he also places on him, this attire, this beged in Hebrew, is some kind of item of value, because of course fine linen's not cheap. It's that expensive stuff. And then the word revid, when it comes about this gold chain, it's referring to, again, just on the Parshat, which is looking at the literal level, is a chain that consists of many links placed in a row. It's like a golden chain. All right, so Yosef was rolling with a gold chain around. So verse 43, all of these things are signs, by the way, just of royalty, right? That Yosef is now having very clear outward signs of being someone who exhibits authority over the then known world. Vayirakev oto b'mirachevet ha-mishne asher lo vayikareu lifnav avrech venaton oto al kol eretz Mitzrayim. And he had him ride in his chariot of second rank, again, to parade him around, to show him, of course, that he was in fact second in command of Paro. And they called out before him, "This is the king's patron," appointing him over the entire land of Egypt. Now, we see something similar happen in the story of Esther. Actually, when Mordechai, the lowly Jew who Haman hated and wanted to kill, when he is rewarded for saving the king from a plot from two other people that were trying to kill him, he is remembered before Achashverosh, the king of Persia at that time, and he parades Mordechai around by being led by Haman, so that all the people can see who the king seeks to honor. Well, in this case, this is the one who the king seeks to honor is Yosef, but not just to honor, of course. In this case, it's to give him actual reign. And so this is a very public way of solidifying his authority. And then in verse 44, Vayome Paro el Yosef ani Pharaoh, uviladecha lo yarim, ish et yado va'et ragelo bechol eretz Mitzrayim. And Paro said to Yosef, "I am Pharaoh, and besides you, no one may lift his hand or his foot in the entire land of Egypt." What does he mean by ani Paro? Like, of course, we know who you are, right? Why does he have to declare in his sentence and saying, "I am Moreh Dylan"? Like, of course, like there's no question as to who you are. But at the same time, the reason he says this and the reason that it bothers Rashi is he says it comes to mean that I have the power as Paro to enact a decree upon my kingdom. And I decree that no one should raise a hand, as it says here, in the entire land of Egypt besides you, right? Which is, again, that uviladecha, that without your express permission, no one should be able to do anything in the kingdom. And so this includes hand or foot, which is an expression, of course, to, as Rashi points out here from the Targum, to bear arms or to raise foot in order to ride a horse, meaning that they're not going to go to war, they're not going to go to battle, they're not going to engage in international conflict without Yosef's express permission. Okay, verse 45, Vayikra Paro Shem Yosef Tzafnah Peneach. So Paro gives him a new name. He says, "You're no longer going to be called Yosef. It's too Jewish, right? We're going to take that name, we're going to remove it, we're going to call you instead Tzafnah Peneach." What Tzafnah Peneach is derived from Egyptian, and it comes to mean the explainer of hidden things. And we're going to see in today's lesson that that's not the exact way that this name translates. However, I will come to say, because it won't be explained in the lessons from today, but just as a side note, Tzafnat Paneach, or the one who reveals that which is hidden, is also an expression of the Messiah, son of Joseph. that the one who is concealed with an Egyptian identity, just as Yeshua today is concealed with the name of Jesus, he's concealed by the system of Christianity that really covers his Jewish heritage, his Jewish roots. As in the case of Yosef, he's now being stripped of his name and given this new name. But at the same time, Zavna Paneach means one who reveals that which is hidden. Right, so in this case, right, it is the job of the followers, the disciples of Yeshua, who is the Messiah, son of Joseph, to reveal his hidden identity, to make him something that is tangible and known. And ultimately, he's the one who is the one who will reveal all the hidden meanings and the secrets of the Torah, and therefore he's the one who will explain hidden things when he returns. This is a messianic expectation. There's many ways to understand Zavna Paneach, and the sages take many pages to explain. Nevertheless, he gave him Vayiten lo et Aznat bat Potifara, that he gave him Aznat. Okay, and this is the daughter of Potifera. Who's Potifera? We know a Potiphar, but we don't know a Potifera. And there's actually a very fascinating commentary that comes to us from our sages that Potiphar is the same as Potifera. Potifera is feminine. Potiphar is masculine. And according to Sota 13b in the Talmud, they state the continuation of that verse, and Potiphar, an officer, Saris, of Peroz, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there, in Genesis 39:1. Rav, a very famous rabbi from one of the Tanaim, the early first centuries, he says he purchased the handsome Yosef for himself, meaning when it says he bought him, it means he bought him for himself, for the intended purposes of having homosexual relations. But that was unable to fulfill his desires. He wasn't able to accomplish this. As the angel Gabriel came and instead castrated Potiphar, which is this word saris. When it says an officer, he plays on the word with the word sariso, which means to castrate. Then Gabriel came again and further mutilated Pharaoh, which is this word here, in the same part of his body, which is why he's called Potiphera, is because ultimately Pharaoh, he was mutilated in the same part of his body. And this is alluded to in the verses that write Potiphar's name differently. Initially, it's written Potiphar, and in this case, in the end, it's written Potiphera. Why? Because he was emasculated, right? The change in name indicates that a part of himself was mutilated. So this is one interpretation that comes to us from our sages of blessed memory concerning why he's referred to here as Potiphera as opposed to Potiphar. And of course, there's probably various allusions that we could talk about as to what this means regarding so much, but merely in the Parshat, the literal meaning of the text, Potiphar is Potiphera. Okay, so whether or not he was truly emasculated or not is a question for another time. Nevertheless, he was the governor of On, or literally the word is Kohen On. He was a priest of On. He was a priest of the god On. Leisha vayetze Yosef al Eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, meaning that he was given this woman for a wife, and therefore Yosef went forth, Yetze, in order to be able to assert his dominance or rule over the kingdom. Okay, so verse, and by the way, that goes back to, in a messianic way, it kind of refers to Aznat is a picture of the Gentile bride of Yosef, who he takes while his identity is hidden. This refers to, like, of course, the remnant that is within Christianity, that Jesus, the Christian Christ, is gathering a remnant from inside the church who desire to reveal his true identity, and that these are the bride that he takes when he rules over the land of Egypt. That is, as he's in a sense ruling in Christianity, but yet Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, we will reveal his true identity, and he will again assert authority over the entire nation of Israel as Yeshua, the Messiah, not the way we've made him out to be. And a lot of this comes out in the work that's referred to as Kol HaTor, or the voice of the turtle dove, which is a work by, technically by the Vilna Gaon, but it's written, I guess, translated by Rabbi Hillel Rivlin, I believe. And so he comes and he gives us basically an identity based upon Joseph's life, what the Messiah, son of Joseph, would do. And so a lot of these allusions are written there. So verse 46, going back to actual Yosef, the Yosef ben Shloshim Shana, the Yosef was 30 years old. Ve'amdo lifnei Paro melech Mitzrayim, vayetze Yosef milifnei Paro or Pharaoh, vaya avor bechol eretz Mitzrayim, that Yosef was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and Yosef went out from before Pharaoh and passed through the entire land of Egypt. Verse 47, v'ta'as ha'aretz v'sheva, shenei ha'sheva likmatzim, that in the 7 years of planning, the land gathered by handfuls, which literally means that the inhabitants of Egypt went out and they gathered in grain upon grain upon grain, and they stored it according to the permission of Yosef, because as we've learned that the people did nothing without Yosef's approval and permission. Verse 48, ויקבוץ את כל אוכל 7 שנים אשר היו בארץ מצרים, וייתן אוכל בערים אוכל שדה, העיר אשר סביבותיה נתן בתוכה. And he collected all the food of the 7 years that was in the land of Egypt, and he placed food in the cities, the food of the field surrounding the city, he put within it. Rashi, quoting from the Midrash, states that because each land preserves its own produce, and they would put into the grain some of the soil of that place, and it would preserve the grain and prevent it from decaying, right? So the reason it comes to explain to us that the food of the field surrounding the city he put within it is to share with us the method by which they collected, they stored, in order that it would not rot. Verse 49. Vayitzbor Yosef bar kechol hayam harbe meod ad ki chadal lispor ki en mispar. The Yosef gathered grain like the sand of the sea in great abundance until they stopped counting, because there was no number. Meaning that it was like, when we use the term en mispar, it's like one's unable to count. There is no ein meaning nothing, mispar meaning counting. It's like it's more than you can even fathom, which also proves to us that ein, that nothing, doesn't always mean nothing, right? It's referring to this idea that they lack the ability to come up with an exact number because it was so numerous. Verse 50. Yosef yulad shene vanim b'terem tavo shenat hara'av asher yadalo as nat bat Potifera kohen on. And to Yosef were born 2 sons. Before we go here, I just want to mention about the building up of the time of plenty and the time of the famine. I don't know if we've said this before or not, but there's a very important lesson already that we could take away from this general idea, because there's a time of famine comes that it consumes all the years of plenty. And it teaches us during the times that we are experiencing what appears like a famine, right? Where as God, or as the prophets wrote, they said that in the time to come there will be a famine, not of food and not of water, but ultimately of the words of God, that people will crave this, right? So we talk about this times of famine, or these times when it doesn't feel like God's presence is tangibly in our life, like we're missing inspiration, maybe we're missing intention, we're missing the place that we desire to be. Well, it's important in those moments, and it's important in those dark times, that we look back at the 7 years of plenty, because even though it may seem like that time is consumed all inspiration, consumed all intentions and everything else, at the same time, if we remember that God blessed us during the 7 years of plenty, we also recognize that he can bless us again, and it'll carry us forward. The miracles of the past give us the inspiration, the strength, the encouragement to be able to continue forward when it seems as if all those times are gone and consumed. So God did it once, he can do it again. All right. And so at this point, as they're storing up for this coming famine, of course, God's given them a forewarning. They're making sure that they have all the appropriate stores, that they'll be able to not only have a monopoly on grain, but that their own will be taken care of. Yosef begins to have children, right? And this is during the time of plenty, right? So it's still during the 7 years. Well, Yosef yulad shenei vanim b'terem tavo shenat hara'av. Yosef were born 2 sons before the year the famine set in. Asher yalda lo as nat bat Potifera kohen on, that it was whom as not the daughter of Potifera, the governor of On, bore to him. Okay. Now, according to Rashi, and he's quoting actually from Tanait 11a here, it is derived from this that a person should not engage in marital relations during a time of famine. And the question is why? Right? And it's really quite simple. The primary reason for engaging in marital relations is to have children. Right? Now, that's not the only reason. Obviously, having marital relations builds intimacy between spouses, as long as it is not done during the time of nidah, or menstruation, which the Torah expressly forbids. But at the same time, it builds intimacy. So even if people cannot have children, or they have children and they're, it's not merely to get pregnant. Otherwise, a husband and wife would separate during the 9 months of pregnancy. They've already accomplished the task. Why continue to be intimate with each other? It's obviously not the point, right? The point is to become one, and this is a continuous process that we do throughout our entire life. Now, Tanait 11a gives us that explanation. It says, Reish Lakish said, it is prohibited for a person to have conjugal relations in the year of famine, so that children not be born during these difficult years. As it is stated in Genesis 41:50, and to Yosef were born 2 sons before the year of famine came. And it was taught in a baraita, nevertheless, those without children may have marital relations in years of famine, as they must strive to fulfill the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply, which of course teaches us that a positive mitzvah here should be sought to be fulfilled. Nevertheless, obviously, when things are going bad, when people are starving, you don't necessarily think to bring a child into the world, especially if you already have fulfilled the mitzvah of having children. It's already hard enough to feed the mouths you have, right? But there was actually a very beautiful lesson that I learned from Rabbi Menace Friedman, actually, who brought this down and stated that a lot of times when we look at having kids, in our culture, there's always like a lot of kids is a scary thing. It's like, oh, that's too much to have more than like 2 or 3. And a lot of it comes down to money. People typically have monetary reasons. Well, according to Rabbi Menace Friedman, again, quoting just from our tradition, children are a blessing, right? And if children are a blessing, then at that point, we should recognize that they bring a tangible blessing into the world. And that means that if we are waiting to become financially stable in order to have more children, we have it backwards, right? That instead, realizing that as we have children, that will bring forth a blessing that will allow us to be able to provide for them. In other words, why would God give you enough for 3 people when you only have 2? Right? But if you have 3, God will provide enough for 3. If you have 10, God will provide enough for 10. Not saying you should have, of course, that many children, but merely to say that we provide a lot of fleshly excuses to God as to why we should not fulfill the mitzvah in a time when it feels like we have a financial famine and things like this. Obviously, we don't live in a time of actual famine where people are starving everywhere. That would not be the time for procreation, according to our verse here. But at the same time, during a time when we feel like we're experiencing a personal famine, maybe when it comes to finances and things like that, this doesn't apply. As we learned from Tanait, that if a person does not have children, then they should seek to fulfill the command to be fruitful and multiply. And Hashem will be the one who ultimately provides the need for that child. Because if Hashem's going to give you the child, He's going to give you what you need to provide for them. And so he has these 2 children on the onset, right before the famine comes, as it says the year before. And in verse 51, these 2 children are named very significant names. It says, Vayikra Yosef et Shem Bechor, that Yosef named the firstborn Menashe. He named him Menashe. And what does Menashe mean? It means to forget. Ki nashani Elohim et kol amali. That God has caused me to forget all of my toil, va'et kol bet avi, and all my father's house, meaning the bitterness, right? The toil, the stress, specifically referring to the exile, right? He's not saying he caused me to forget my father. He's saying it's caused me to forget the negative associations that he has now with his father's house because he was sold, right? This is his moment where he's let it go. He is not forgetting where he came from. He's not forgetting his tradition, because you got to realize he's already put on Egyptian clothes and he's already cut his hair and he's already gotten to the point where he is taking on an Egyptian name. He's married an Egyptian bride, right? He is in a foreign land, but that is taking on all these things. He's completely coded. And amidst all of that, he says, I don't forget where I came from, right? I don't forget where I came from. I completely forget the bitterness. Right? The idea here is this word of kol amali, all of the bitterness. Okay, verse 52. Va'et shem hashani kara Ephraim ki hifrani Elohim be'eretz aniya ani. So he says here that the second one he named Ephraim, and the reason for this is because God has made me fruitful. Right? This word hifrani comes from the word Ephraim, or at least Ephraim comes from Ephrani, and so in this time of his affliction, his ani, he is experiencing fruit, right? And of course, I think there's a tangible lesson here that it's in the midst of struggle, it's in the midst of hardship that we are fruitful. It's there that our mitzvot count the most, as we've talked about before, and as we will say again and again as it becomes relevant. One mitzvah performed, one commandment performed in difficulty is better than 100 performed at ease, right? This is the words of our sages. So This is something that Yosef intimately understood. Now, going into our lessons from today's reading, the first thing we need to understand is that from Yosef's name, right, his Egyptian name is Zavnat Paneach, that he was someone who was an explainer of hidden things. However, this appears to be backwards based upon the actual translation of the words Zavnat Paneach. It actually should have been Paneach Zavnat, because the way it stands right now, Zavnat Paneach, is that he's the hidden things explainer, which may make sense in English. In Hebrew, it's a little harder to comprehend. It should read Paneach Zavnat, the explainer of hidden things. But there's a lesson here. The lesson is that we learn from this that Yosef merited, he only merited the ability to discern hidden things because he was exceedingly humble. He concealed, what was the hidden thing? He concealed his righteous deeds, which is which shows a growth, right? We talk about when we're introduced to Yosef in Genesis chapter 37, he brought evil reports to his father Yaakov about his brothers, right? And of course, we talked about how those evil reports were those unjustified words where he's saying, oh, they're eating meat from, they strangled an animal, or oh, they did this, or oh, they did that. And of course, we knew that they were basically, his perception was skewed. In reality, they weren't justified words. And as a result of that, Mida connected Mida, he was judged measure for measure because he said this happened to him, because he said this happened to him. But in addition to this, as we talked about, another interpretation was that his outwardly righteous actions shined a negative light on the flaws of his brothers, right? He was so outwardly pious, right? He was such a good scholar. He was somebody who was so good at keeping the traditions and the commands of his father that this shined a negative light on his brothers, who were not necessarily wicked, but were not at Yosef's level. And this is what, again, Kohelet or Ecclesiastes writes, do not be overly righteous. It causes problems. Just like in another place in that same verse, it says, don't be overly wicked. So the idea here, and of course our sages go so far as to say, make sure you're not wicked in your own eyes as well, right? Which should keep ourselves accountable to our level and knowing where we are and knowing that we can go higher and that we should never go below our current level. But per the Safat Emes, he says this. He says Zavnat, this is the growth in Yosef. Zavnat means that it is because he conceals his deeds of righteousness that he was paneach, that he was able to discover and explain hidden things, which is why it's put in this order. So in the same vein, Yeshua warns in Matthew 6:1, and we've read this before, take care not to practice your righteousness in the sight of people, to be noticed by them. Well, hold on, full stop. Matthew 5, verse 17 or 16 says something very different. It says, let your light so shine before men that they would see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So which is it? Should people see my good deeds or should people not see my good deeds? The idea here is the kavanah, it's the intention, right? If your intention is to be seen, then you miss the point. But if people so happen to see when you perform a mitzvah, right? You're not seeking to be seen, but it so happens to be seen because it's a part of your everyday life, and they give glory to God because of it, because what you do is something that puts a good taste in their mouth, then Baruch Hashem. But if you do so in order to be seen, this is a lack of modesty, this is pride, this is arrogance. So he says, take care not to practice your righteousness in the sight of people to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Why? Because the attention you receive that you're trying to get is in fact your reward. Walking modestly, this idea of tzniut, is a key characteristic of our walk with God. We learn in Micha 6:8, it says, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only that you seek justice, that you love kindness, and that you walk humbly, or modestly, actually, is the word, with God. V'hatzniya lechet. The word v'hatzniya is from this word tzniut, modesty, privateness, as if we're walking with God alone, step by step. And the Talmud tells us that these three, the prophet, Micha, sought to take the entire Torah and sum it up in 3 commandments, just like Yeshua does with 2. Yeshua says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That all the Torah and the prophets hang on these 2. Well, the prophet Amos sums it up to 3. Seek justice, love kindness, and walk modestly. And so what does it mean to walk modestly? Okay, we learn actually from Sukkah 49b. Rabbi Eliezer said, what is the meaning of this verse? He asked the same question I just asked. It's been told to you, O man, what is good and what the Lord does require of you, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To do justly, this is mishpat. This is justice, right? This is the commandments of justice, right? The things that we are to perform in order to maintain a balance in society. To love mercy, what is this? Gamilut chasadim. This is acts of kindness that we perform, going above and beyond, especially to those who don't deserve it, and especially to those who can never pay us back. And to walk humbly with your God. This is referring to a modesty, to taking the indignant dead out for burial and accompanying a poor bride to her wedding canopy, both of which must be performed without fanfare. The Gemara, the voice of the Talmud, summarizes. And are these matters not inferred? Kal v'chomer, a fortiori, the idea of light to heavy argument. If this is the case, how much more so is this the case? And what is that a fortiori? If with regards to matters that tend to be conducted in public, such as the multitudes participating in funerals and weddings, the Torah says instead, walk modestly, privately, then in matters that tend to be conducted in private, giving charity and studying Torah, how much more should those be conducted privately? So what is the privateness that we should have? Even Yeshua says, when you give tzedakah, do it in private so that your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing, right? Don't make a ton of noise and blow shofars as you give it. And studying Torah, right? Don't announce some big fanfare about the fact that you're doing what you should be doing in your relationship with God. If people see it, great. Let them give glory to your Father who's in heaven. Who has a God so near to them? Who has a Torah so wise? But in this case, it's not to be seen. If you're seen, it's a byproduct. And so this is the general idea of walking privately or modestly with God, as if your relationship with him is one-on-one and nobody else is there. And so walking modestly becomes not only an integral aspect of our walk with God, it's also the key to discerning and understanding divine revelation. We learn from our sages of blessed memory that a person who is prideful or haughty or even angry, who is incapable of walking modestly, that the divine spirit leaves him and that the wisdom that he's obtained flees. The second lesson we learned from today is that in verse 51-52, we're introduced to Yosef's two sons. And that his two sons, based upon their names, actually represent Yosef's messianic approach to the world around him. We live in exile, just as Yosef was in exile. But in his sons, he saw his approach. The first aspect of this approach is that he's in the world. He's in the world in order to engage with it positively. This is like what Yeshua says when he tells his disciples, go into all nations and make disciples in order to teach them, to immerse them, to teach them all that I command you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. But at the same time, even though we're in the world in order to affect it positively, we're not of it. Meaning we have to guard ourselves from harmful influences. Yeshua says the same thing. When he says, I pray, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, O God, but that you keep them from evil. And so guarding ourselves, it's actually technically flipped, right? Not to be of the world, but to be in the world is the actual, even though we say in it, but not of it as an expression, and you typically hear. But being not in of the world is first and foremost before we can actually engage positively with the world around us. And why? Because if we let our personal borders go and we fail to hold to our Jewish values, and the biblical values are Jewish values, and our belief in Yeshua as the Messiah, the divine Messiah of Judaism, then we won't be able to bring any meaningful impact on the world around us. If we reject Torah, if we reject the Bible, if we reject Yeshua, God forbid, then we won't be able to make a positive impact on the household of Israel or the world around us. And this is represented by Yosef's son Manasseh, the first son that comes into the world. As he says, exile causes one to forget. That is, him being in Egypt causes people to forget, his family, his heritage. He's saying, I'm not going to forget. My son is going to be a reminder to me that even though exile is long and it is harsh, I'm not going to forget where I came from. I'm not going to forget my heritage and my connection. But once we've built up this inner strength, and once we've made the resolve not to compromise, only then can we be fruitful. Only then can we shine and impact the world around us, which is represented by Yosef's second son, Ephraim. As it says, he will be fruitful. But hold up. Because in that reading, again, it says that this was at a time, Be'eretz Ani, in a time in a land of affliction. Let's say we've guarded ourselves from evil influences. We are holding to our values. We're holding to our beliefs. We're keeping faith. And now we're seeking to engage in the world around us to be positively impacting them. And we seek to bear fruit in the world now. Realize that it is in a land of affliction. It is in exile, which means that the more we push to be fruitful, the more the suffering is going to come upon his people. Paul tells Timothy, he says, one who desires to live a godly life in Messiah Yeshua will be persecuted. Affliction, suffering, hardship, difficulty is a natural thing in our upward ascension. The higher we go, the more the flesh, the more the things of this world seek to pull us down. The higher you go, the more difficult the gravity, the heavier the gravity. And so as our divine soul elevates, expect these things. But Yeshua says, in this world you have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And this is, of course, not only an encouraging message, but it's the reality that as long as we stick to Torah, as long as we stick to the teachings of Yeshua, our Rebbe, our Messiah, we will succeed, even in the face of hardship. And we will not forget, but we will be fruitful. And so that is the lesson that we can take away from today's reading in Genesis 41:39 through 41:52.